Hi, it's Jeff with Oru Kayak. Today we're going to talk about probably the most important things when you're deciding if you're going out paddling for a day. And those things are tides, currents, wind and weather. So I'm going to break each one of those down for you. When we're thinking about tides, tides are long period wave. Okay, that's what actually a tide is. And the tide is affected by the gravitational pull between the moon and the sun's gravitational pull on our waterways. So we have two high tides during the day and we have two low tides during the day, and typically those are going to be roughly about 6 hours apart. Why is that important to us? Well, we need to know what the tide is when we're launching and landing, so that we are coming to a place where we can actually launch and land with that tide. There's some places in a lot of bays where we literally are in marshland when it's at low tide and you just can't launch. So super important for those reasons. The tides as they come are going to affect our currents. We can talk a little bit about currents in a second, but the tides, when they're coming in, that's a bay is being filled with water, that's called the flood. And when the water is leaving the bay, that's called an ebb. We want to know what's going on and which way that water is moving so that we can have the safest mode of travel. So on our tides, we want to know when it's a high tide, when it's a low tide, and in between those two tides is something called a slack tide. Slack tide is going to be where there's little to no current, and that's really important for us because we can only paddle so fast. So on average, a kayaker is going to paddle 2 knots if they're a beginner intermediate paddler. If you're really getting after it, you might be able to paddle at 3 knots, 4 if you're just gung-ho, but you can't sustain that for long periods of time. So why is that important? Well, if I'm going out and the current on that day is 5 knots and I can only paddle at 2 knots, what's happening if I'm paddling against that tide? I'm getting beat up. I'm either trying way too hard to paddle forward and I'm getting beat up by the current, or I'm going backwards when I'm paddling forwards and I'm not getting anywhere. And that can present to be a problem. Another item with the tides that we want to look at is if we're going to plan to maybe go to an island, we want to ride the tides there and ride them back. And what does that mean? Well, if I'm going to a certain island, I want to look and see when there's perhaps a flood that'll take me over to that island from where I'm going to launch my boat. And then I want to be there around slack tide and paddle back either at slack or when there's an ebb where I can ride that tide back. That's going to give you the most ability to deal with any other items that might come up when you're paddling. A lot of this information as far as tides and currents are readily available on the internet. So you can go to NOAA, it's one website. There's ACA, which is the American Association teaching body for canoe and kayak. We'll put links to that down below so you can find those things out. But those are readily available. There's tide books. Some are artistically drawn, and so they're a neat kind of coffee table book, but you can go and usually get a free copy at any of the marinas. Ask for the current tide book and you can see what those tides are going to be in print form. We also want to know what's going to go on with the weather. What's the wind prediction for the day? Now, the wind prediction is a prediction. So they may think it's going to be 12 knots and you get out there and it's upwards of 20, gusting 30. So these predictions are really just something that you can try to plan around, but also know that if there's higher or lower winds, you can adjust your float plan according to that. How do we know about winds? Well, there's ways that we can just look when we're currently out at the area and see, okay, this is about this type of wind. The more and more you paddle, the better you get at that. But typically, beginner paddlers to intermediate paddlers, somewhere in and around and under 16 knots is going to be a more comfortable environment for you. What does 16 knots look like? When you look out at a body of water and you start to see some waves cresting, and it looks like there's quite a bit, but not too many waves cresting, that's going to be 16 knots. 12 knots is usually when we have branches moving, or you have a flag and it's straight out from the direction. It's not necessarily flapping, but it's straight out. That's going to tell you it's about 12 knots. Really important to have your exit points when you're talking about how conditions change. When the wind picks up, it's nice to be able to come to a place that's protected like this. I have open water that's out in front of me, but I'm in this kind of protected haven right here. Marinas are great for that. Bodies of water that are protected by land are excellent places to be able to get in and out of the wind. You also might think about where can we get out if it's just not what I can handle. My skill set isn't ready for these conditions. Okay, well, is there a place that I can go, make a phone call and have someone pick me up? Paddle another day. Super important to go with a team of people that are experienced, have been out and in these conditions before. But you can get better and better at deciding where you're going to go and how those conditions are going to be, and it's going to make you safer in the future. I hope this video is helpful for dealing with the conditions. If there's other videos that you'd be interested in seeing, go ahead and leave something in the comments below, and we'll look at those comments. Happy to make a video that can give you some more insight and make it safer for you paddling in the future. I'm Jeff with Oru Kayak, and I look forward to seeing you on the water.